Everyone, this is Jennifer from Summa Counseling, and today we will be reviewing 10 examples of why college statements, seeing what worked and what didn't work. As a reminder, a successful why college essay has two components. The first is the incorporation of specific and colorful information about yourself and your past experiences. The second is the inclusion of specific information about the college that you're applying to. And if you have both of these components in your essay, then you can feel assured that you're writing a memorable and strong why college statement. Let's start off by looking at three short answers. The first is a very strong statement written by Gabriella about why she wants to attend Tufts. And one of the unique things that Gabriella does is she includes a student quote. And it goes, "You have the power to make a difference. You can't tell a Tufts student no." You might argue that that embodies a bit of a cliched idea, and it's true, but Gabriella puts a unique twist to it by defining it in her own words. And she goes on to explain that what's so special about Tufts to her is that it is a progressive community of individuals. And ultimately, this is the heart of her short answer. She goes on to show that she's done her homework. She knows that Tufts students are called jumbos, that they organize a 5K every year called the Zombie, and she cites a particular class that she would like to take, Rise and Decay of the West. And finally, she weaves in a little bit of personal information by mentioning Thomas More and his theory of the impossibility of a true social utopia. And that shows that she's well read, that she's obviously familiar with this particular philosopher, and is able to reference him in making her point about why she wants to go to Tufts. As a side note, it is also very strong that she shows she was following the Twitter account for Tufts and not simply just regurgitating information that is on the website. So, if we move on to Katie's short answer, we see that there's some strengths and weaknesses in her response, and so I've categorized it as a moderately strong statement. First, many of her sentences are a bit general. She says that she has a passion for helping others without ever explaining what that means or being more specific. And as we all know, pretty much any kind of community service activity has a goal of helping other people. She also talks about valuing a community that would appreciate her talents, which is a good goal to have, but again, she never specifies what her talents are. So after reading her statement, we don't have a very good sense of who Katie is as a person. She does do a good job of making some very specific college references. She talks about the America Reads and the Alternative Break program. But on the other hand, her essay overall is a bit wordy given that it's a short statement. And I would point out that her concluding sentence is over 40 words, which looks to be at least a third of her entire short essay. And even worse, it doesn't really convey any kind of a specific message. She talks about how NYU has the potential to change her life and make an everlasting impact. But again, those are fairly vague claims. They're not very specific. So ultimately, her response is on the average side. And finally, as an example of an essay you don't want to write, essay number 3 is about why a particular student wants to study computer engineering. And what you'll notice fairly quickly is that this essay doesn't have any specific references at all, neither about the student's personal interests or experience or about the college's programs, classes, or professors. This is a general statement that could be sent to any college that you're applying to with a computer engineering department, which most colleges have. So, for that reason, it fails as a strong why college statement. The student is fairly specific about what they hope to study, which is great. But again, it has to be connected with very specific details about their personal experience. What have they done in their past that makes them want to study X, Y, and Z? And it also has to be connected to how this particular college is going to help them study X, Y, and Z. So without those two components, the essay is not very strong. Now let's move on to some longer essays. The first is Why Penn International Studies and Economics, and this is a reference to the dual degree program that Penn has. Now, I consider this a moderately strong statement, again, because it has a lot of strengths and weaknesses. The student does do a good job of incorporating personal details, such as her knowledge of French and her extensive travels of the world. But I would point out that the essay would have been much stronger if she told us a story or gave us an anecdote about her cosmopolitan past, or maybe a significant experience that she had while she was traveling overseas that taught her some kind of a memorable or important lesson. It is completely acceptable to consider the Why College essay as a type of a personal statement. So, on to the next point. The student does do a good job of mentioning that she shadowed two Huntsman freshmen and that in fact she's made 3 different visits to Penn. These are strong details to include because colleges do like evidence that you're very committed to going there and that you've invested a lot of time to find out what it's like before applying. This particular student also had some good specific Penn details, references, wanting to play on the tennis team, and volunteering for the West Philadelphia tutoring project. However, her purpose at Penn is a bit vague, and this particular student does seem to be undeclared or at least to have very broad interests. She mentions wanting to study or take classes in economics and business as well as international studies. But she doesn't go into much depth in terms of those departments. She doesn't talk about why she would want to study those. Does she have some future career goal? If she's maybe been involved in certain extracurricular activities that lead her to think these fields are a perfect fit for her. So, in terms of her academic passions, the essay comes across as a little bit vague. And here's where I want to point out that even if you're undeclared and you don't know your exact major, you don't have to write the Why College essay in general terms. You can still be very specific, but simply choose a subject that excites you or that you would really be curious to learn more about and specifically explain why. Perhaps you find neuropsychology very fascinating, and this might be related to an internship you've done or a special research project that was a high school assignment. The content doesn't matter so much as the conveying of a very specific personal story that helps the reader get to know more about you and your interests. So, essay 4 was a moderately strong statement. Moving on to essay 5, this similarly is moderately strong, and it's about why Northwestern and also about a dual degree program in economics and music. Now, this student started off very strong with a really fascinating and specific example of why she's so drawn to macroeconomics. And not just macroeconomics, but in particular, international trade and how countries calculate their imports and exports. Now, that might sound a little bit mundane to the average person who's not interested in economics, but this student goes on to give some very concrete examples about why this can be a rather intellectually complex issue and pose some interesting questions. So that part was very strong. The difficulty is that this student doesn't really have specific references to the economics department at Penn. We have no idea what classes she might want to take there, what professors she would want to study under, any kind of research that she would be interested in. So it's a little bit light on the college details. And finally, when she moves on to talking about her interest in the Bynum School of Music, she has the reverse problem, which is that she has a lot of great specific college references so that we know why the Bynum College of Music draws her in. But we really have no idea why she wants to double major in music. She doesn't talk about why music is important to her or any of her past experiences in music. So that is a little bit lacking. And obviously, anytime you're writing about a double major, you do have the challenge of trying to squeeze in a lot of content in a single essay because then you have to write about both components, personal and college, for each major. And that's a lot to bite off. But it can be done. Next, we have an essay about why Northwestern and the dual degree program for computer engineering and music. And again, this is a moderately strong statement. There are strengths and weaknesses. The student did do a really good job of referencing a particular professor, Dr. Kung, and mentioned an interest in environmental chemistry. But the student could have taken it much further and talked about why chemical engineering and in particular environmental chemistry would be interesting, and are there any research projects that he would want to work on? Is there any personal experience he has in environmental issues or causes that make him particularly interested in studying under Dr. Kung? So ultimately, his reasons seem a little bit light on specific colorful references and stories. As to the second part of his essay on the Bynum School of Music, the student has very good specific references to the College of Music, just like the last essay. But again, she does not really talk about her own personal interest in music and why she would want to major in music. All that we really find out is that she plays the clarinet, which is not a very significant detail. Now, finally, our last string of moderately successful essays is about the Jerome Fisher Management and Technology program at Penn. And this combines a business degree with studies in technology, which would be very appealing to many students who grew up in Silicon Valley. And that's the focus of this student's essay. What this student did really well is specifically talk about Penn and aspects of the Jerome Fisher program. He mentions the Gorgon Entrepreneurial Management Program and the Snyder Entrepreneurial Research Center. So he's clearly done his homework and he nails the why college component. In terms of the personal component of revealing specific colorful information about his own past, that part is a little bit superficial. All that we really know about him is that he grew up in Silicon Valley, and he mentions having a natural hunger for challenges and competition, and that his personal philosophy is that he has a deep respect for risk taking and an entrepreneurial spirit. Those are all great details, but they're fairly general and impersonal. What would have been much better is if he could have talked about some entrepreneurial venture that he might have started. What did he learn from it? What were the challenges and obstacles that he faced? And what caused him to feel like that experience would make him excited for entrepreneurial projects during college and after college? So, more personal detail would have made that essay much stronger. Now, we move on to our first very strong statement, which is not to say that it's perfect. There's definitely still ways it could be improved. But the next essay, which I call Why Penn Easy to Find, is about a student who actually started his own website. And not just that, it's obvious that this website had a fairly substantial reach, which he highlights in his opening paragraph. And I'll read it very briefly to give you a sense of how strong your opening can be if you include a lot of numerical or statistical information. 2 months of coding and design, endless all-nighters. Now the time had come. The service was set to go live the following day. 1 day later, 6 countries. 1 week later, 14 countries. 3 months later, 78 countries. So this student goes on to explain his website called Easy to Find, and it's a fairly simple idea, which is that instead of all the services readily available, now online dictionaries that let you define a word one at a time, his service lets you type in a whole list of words and have it instantly defined so that you can save a lot of time. It's a very simple idea, but what's powerful is that clearly a lot of people started using this service all across the globe, and his website was featured in fairly prominent blogs. So his impact goes above and beyond what the typical high school student is able to do, even in coming up with a website or some kind of application. And this student did a great job of giving us that picture of the magnitude of his innovation. And then he transitions to actually talking about an academic passion, which is learning how to imitate the human brain using content from a lot of different academic disciplines. And that's also interesting. And finally, he touches on his goal of wanting to help the common man or the less privileged classes of society. We learned that he grew up in India, and admittedly, that's a little bit more of a cliched idea. And also, the latter part of his essay could probably have been significantly condensed and streamlined. The ideas probably could have also been reordered as well so that the essay felt more coherent and could have been sizably reduced. But at the same time, what I would point out is that when a student opens with such strong and interesting content, a lot of the later weaknesses an admissions officer can more easily overlook. So that's how I would characterize the Easy to Find essay. Now, moving on, our next essay is also very strong. It is a Why Duke essay for the Duke China campus. And you can see, just like the Easy to Find essay, the opening is very direct and impactful. He starts off by describing himself as perseverant, intelligent, and a problem solver. And this essay doesn't have the problem of the previous essay. This one is fairly condensed so that you feel every sentence you read, it contains a very relevant, interesting idea, and that there's not a lot of extraneous words so that the student could have cut down the essay further and incorporated the same amount of content. This essay is very streamlined, and he starts off talking about his daydreams and innovations. While he's in the shower, he thinks about the idea of channeling gray water, which is the wastewater from a shower, to potentially flush toilets on all subsequent lower floors. And this, of course, is a little more relevant because he's a student living in China, where a lot of the population does live in skyscrapers. And he goes on to talk a lot about his innovative ideas in artificial intelligence. And the key is that he always gives us a very specific, colorful, concrete example. And that's what makes the essay come alive and seem very interesting. He does also have very excellent specific references to Duke faculty and departments. He specifically cites Dr. Wang and his work on modern machine learning algorithms. And we understand very well why the student would want to work with Dr. Wang because he has done such a good job of explaining his own passion for computer science and artificial intelligence, and in fact, all the innovations and creative ideas that he's already had. I do feel ultimately that this student probably could have expanded the why Duke portion of his essay a little bit more. Ultimately, it's a pretty short paragraph, but at the same time, that's a fairly minor critique, given that he did have both components, the personal component and the why college component, and he pulled off such strong, specific, colorful details in the essay. So this was a very strong essay. And our last essay, Why Penn T.C. Chan Center, probably is, in my opinion, the most memorable of the entire portfolio. You'll see that just like the previous two strong essays, this one opens with a very impactful story of how she started experimenting with Google SketchUp in ninth grade. And always the more interesting story than how, I won the soccer game or how I placed first in this competition is actually how I struggled or how I produced a drawing that maybe wasn't so good. And she uses a little bit of humor when she says that the rendition of her apartment looked to her brother like a really large, complicated toilet. So she starts off with a bit of a joke, and then she transitions into talking about two personal experiences which really shine through for their uniqueness and the degree of impact she had. She had an internship at Studio Korea, which is an architecture firm, and talks about how proactive she was, how she actually, on the side, produced five different sets of plans for a particular client project and presented them to her boss, even though that wasn't required of her as a volunteer intern. And then secondly, her story about the My School Road initiative is similarly colorful and unique because she is able to rally all these students and clean the neighborhoods around her school. And certainly it seems like the project at the end of it had a very wide impact, and she was able to recruit and motivate quite a few students to get involved. So at the end of the day, she gives a very compelling story for why she is interested in environmentally sustainable architecture, which, to be honest, from one perspective, is already a very unique major to have. But the stories that she gives in her essay makes it all the more unique. And as she tells her story, she does include very specific, concrete information about the T.C. Chan Center and its environmentally sustainable principles. And ultimately, this leads her to producing a very strong essay. So, hopefully, having reviewed all these samples gives you a very concrete idea of how to construct your own why college essay.